Hi everybody, my name's Andriy. Welcome to Med School EU. In today's lecture, we're going to continue talking about anatomy and physiology. More specifically, we will discuss the diseases associated with the circulatory and the respiratory system. So today I'm going to give a quick introduction into some of the most common diseases associated with those two systems that we have discussed in the previous three lectures. So first, let's talk about some of the common circulatory system diseases. And we will begin with some heart diseases. So heart has many diseases, but some of the most common ones are going to be the congenital heart disease. So congenital heart disease is associated with any heart disease that occurs from birth. It's any birth defects, murmurs in the heart, things like that. They are all part of this one branch called congenital heart disease. And it is qualified to be one of the most common types of birth defects. Next, we're going to discuss myocardial infarction. So this is a very common one. This is the medical term, myocardial infarction, and this is just a common heart attack. So heart attacks occur when part of the heart muscle does not get enough oxygen. It does not get enough blood, so then eventually that part of it dies out. So if you have, for example, a blood clot in the coronary artery, which is the artery that supplies blood to the heart muscle. So again, every cell in the body needs blood. It needs oxygen, it needs nutrients. And the heart is not an exception. So when the heart pumps out blood all over the body, it also must pump blood to its own cells, its own cardiac cells. And those, the blood that goes through there, it goes through these coronary arteries. And typically when you've got a heart attack or myocardial infarction, that is when there is a blockage in one of the coronary arteries, which then part of the heart muscle is going to die out because it's not receiving enough oxygen supply. So when the heart muscle does not receive enough nutrients, enough oxygen supply for X amount of minutes, that part of the heart is going to die out and it's never going to regenerate. Heart muscle, unfortunately, does not regenerate just like skeletal muscle does. Now we got something called cardiac arrest. That is typically when the heart stops beating and it needs to be resuscitated. That is when the heart stops. This is typically associated with an electrical problem, so the SA node is not working properly, or there's a blockage in the electrical activity of bundle of His or the AV node. Basically, the heart, electrical activity of the heart is not stimulating it, therefore the heart stops. It stops doing its function, and the person undergoes cardiac arrest where the heart is no longer beating. And typically in more older and diseased individuals, we get something called heart failure. The general definition of heart failure is when the heart is not doing its function to the fullest. So it's not able to pump enough blood around the body. That is the general definition. And it typically occurs when the heart becomes too weak or too stiff. It does not have enough elastic fibers, and it is just a frail heart. Now let's take a look at some blood vessel diseases. So first, one of the more common ones is aneurysm. And aneurysms is basically just a bulge in the blood vessel. So if you have a blood vessel running smoothly like this, due to weakness in one of the walls or parts of the walls, you get this bulge, kind of like this. So this bulge is called aneurysm. And an aneurysm could burst, and it could lead to a lot of problems. And typically, if it bursts, if it's a major artery and there's a aneurysm that bursts in a major artery, most do not make it to the hospital, and they bleed out because there's a crazy amount of blood pressure. For example, if this is something that happens in the aorta or if this happens in the pulmonary artery, that's where there's lots of blood pressure going on. And typically the person does not have favorable outcomes. Now we got terms like hypotension and hypertension. And hypertension is basically high blood pressure. Hypotension is low blood pressure. We got strokes, we got thrombosis, and well, a stroke is obviously defined as a block in the brain, block of blood flow in the brain, and this could be caused by various things like ischemia, brain bleed, or it could be caused by a blockage, so thrombosis. This is commonly defined as a blood clot. All of these things could potentially lead to a stroke. Another fancy term is arteriosclerosis, and that's typically just, it's a chronic disease because it occurs over time, and it's basically when the blood vessels are too stiff and become too thick and that restrict blood flow, and which of course may lead to blood clots like thrombosis, but it restricts blood flow to vital organs and other tissues because the arteries simply become too thick and unable to stretch properly to modify for the blood pressure. And finally, looking at the blood diseases, and typically these would be associated with the cells of the blood. So first, there's various kinds of anemia. So we've got iron deficiency anemia. So iron deficiency anemia, if your red blood cells are low on iron, they're not going to be able to carry as much oxygen as they can, because again, each of the hemoglobin molecules, they also have iron in them. And if your body or your blood is iron deficient, they will not be able to carry oxygen to its full capacity, which may, of course, induce anemia. Another type of anemia would be aplastic. And aplastic anemia is associated with the body not producing enough red blood cells, and you're going to be red blood cell deficient, which will obviously induce anemia as well. We also got sickle cell anemia. That's when the red blood cells are kind of in this semi-lunar orientation instead of nice and round. They're kind of in these shapes, and they're diseased because they're not able to carry as much oxygen and as much hemoglobin as the regular blood cells. So of course it would induce anemia as well. Another very common one, especially among children, is leukemia. And leukemia is due to high production of white blood cells. So, and this would typically be immature white blood cells. So our bone marrow that would be producing white blood cells at a certain concentration. Leukemia is when you've got cancer. So leukemia is cancer of the white blood cells, where they're going to be produced uncontrollably, and they're going to take up space inside the blood vessels. So the composition of the blood is not going to be 1% white blood cells. It's going to increase to a crazy percentage of white blood cells, and it's going to take up a lot more space. So it's going to make the blood more viscous. It's not going to flow as well, and it causes all kinds of problems, including anemia as well. So leukemia, there's lots of different types of leukemia, but the more common ones are involved with the white blood cells. Another common one is called hemophilia, and hemophilia is a genetic disorder. You're going to see this a lot on pedigrees. So hemophilia is, again, you're born with it typically, and it is characterized by poor blood clotting. So the platelets are not going to be doing their job very well, and if you have a cut or you have internal bleeding, it causes major problems for the person because the blood is not able to clot, or is not able to clot fast enough. So you would get major bleeds, and even just a little cut if you cut your finger or you cut your hand by accident, this could be a major problem for hemophiliac patients. And also hemophilia patients, if they have bruises, that could be another major problem. Sometimes they have to go to hospitals because they got a little bruise and the bleeding cannot be stopped. So hemophilia is another very dangerous and unfortunately it is a common blood disease. So in the A-level textbooks, the British education system, they talk a lot about effects of smoking, and since the IMAT exam is made from Cambridge University, which comes from Britain, they're going to be taking a look at a lot of the A and AS levels in terms of the biology and the chemistry section. So I figured it's important to know the effects of smoking, the ingredients that are involved with it, and how they're going to impact the respiratory and the circulatory system. So some of the main components of cigarette smoke that pose a threat to human health are tar. So we've got tar, we got carbon monoxide, and nicotine. So that's the three major components that cause problems for people. In general, tar and carcinogens damage the gas exchange system, and carbon monoxide and nicotine damage the cardiovascular system, so the circulatory system primarily. Tar is a mixture of compounds that settles on the lining of the airways in the lungs, and it stimulates a series of changes that may lead to obstructive lung disease, and that's typically caused by tar. It could also lead to lung cancer as well. So that's the ingredient that leads to lung cancer when we've got a chronic smoker. And of course, carcinogens are also cancer-causing compounds that cause mutations within the genes that would control cell division. So let's talk about chronic bronchitis. Chronic bronchitis typically occurs with most chronic smokers. So the tar in the cigarette smoke stimulates goblet cells and mucus glands to enlarge and secrete more mucus. So remember the goblet cells that were typically located in the trachea and the bronchi, those goblet cells and the glands are going to produce more mucus than needed because of stimulation from the tar if you are a chronic smoker. Now, the tar also inhibits the cleaning action of the ciliated epithelium that lines the airway. So the airways are lined with cilia. Now, cilia are not going to be doing their function as well because they're going to be broken by tar. So tar is going to basically inhibit or destroy the action of cilia. And cilia are used, they're basically these projections that push all the bacteria and the viruses and all the bad stuff, they push it back up the stream so you could cough it out. And that's typically how a healthy lung behaves. However, when tar is going to destroy the cilia, then there's going to be no cleaning action. And when there's no cleaning action and an increased production of mucus, you're going to have mucus accumulating in the bronchioles, and the smallest bronchioles become obstructed. So this leads to obstruction. Now this causes more problems because when mucus is not moved along, this causes the viruses and the bacteria and all the germs to build up within the bronchioles that are obstructed because there's no movement of air, there's no cleaning action. So this causes even more problems when bacteria and viruses actually collect inside of the bronchioles. And this typically what stimulates the smoker's cough. Then we've got scar tissue replacing the damaged cilia. And of course, scar tissue does not do any function other than just being there and arranged in a random manner. And the smooth muscle surrounding the bronchioles and the bronchi become much thicker. So this thickening of the airways causes them to narrow and makes it difficult to breathe. And this is why there's an easier potential to be infected with things like pneumonia, and developing all of those viral infections. So this entire thing, all of these symptoms are going to be called chronic bronchitis. This is when you get the smoker's cough, and they're chronically going to be coughing because of all the damage that tar has caused to the lining of the airways. Another disease we're going to discuss is called emphysema. So the inflammation of the constantly infected lungs causes phagocytes to leave the blood and line the airways. And phagocytes are white blood cells that are there to do cleanup. They're there to destroy things, and they form this pus that would typically come out from an infected area in the body. So the phagocytes are these white blood cells that remove bacteria from there, and they kill the bacteria and they remove it from there. However, there must be proper circulation to do that. So to reach the lining of the lungs from the capillaries, phagocytes release the protein digesting enzyme called elastase. And elastase breaks down elastic fibers. And the problem with that is that the alveoli are, of course, they're lined with elastin fibers, as you can see here, all around. In order for the alveoli to recoil, when you're breathing out, the alveoli must recoil back to its original shape. And the recoiling happens due to the elastin fiber. Now, because the phagocytes are going to produce more elastase, it's going to break down the elastin fiber around the alveolus, and now it's not going to recoil as much. As you can see here, it's not going to recoil back to its original shape. And elastin's responsible for that recoil, and with much smaller quantities of that elastin because it was broken down, the alveoli do not stretch and recoil when breathing in and out. And as a result, the bronchioles collapse during expiration, trapping air in the alveoli, which often bursts. So you get a bursting of the alveoli, and this reduces the surface area for gas exchange. And the number of capillaries also decreases, so less oxygen is absorbed into the blood. So you are chronically going to have lower oxygen saturation. And this is all caused by emphysema. And that's, again, it's going to be from the chronic bronchitis because you get more infections that are not able to clear up. And all of this is caused by tar. Now we're going to discuss the cardiovascular system effects. And that's going to be the short-term effects by carbon monoxide and nicotine. So nicotine is a drug in tobacco. It is absorbed very easily by the blood and travels to the brain within seconds. It stimulates the nervous system to reduce the diameter of the arterioles and to release a hormone called adrenaline from the adrenal glands. So it causes vasoconstriction as it travels to the brain and release of adrenaline. So what are the effects of vasoconstriction and increased production of adrenaline? Well, typically you get an increased heart rate and blood pressure, heart rate and BP. And there's going to be a decrease in blood supply to the body. And typically that's going to be decreased blood supply to the hands and the feet, to the extremities. And due to the increased heart rate and blood pressure and vasoconstriction, this increases the risk of blood clotting. Another problem with nicotine is that it is highly addictive drug, so it increases the production of dopamine, and each time that you have those short-term effects of nicotine, you get a release of dopamine. Therefore, this is why smoking is addictive. Now, the problem with carbon monoxide, so the CO problem, and there's something called CO poisoning, carbon monoxide poisoning. This is why you have carbon monoxide detectors at home, because when carbon monoxide enters and it diffuses into the alveoli and it enters into the blood from the lungs, it diffuses into the red blood cells very easily, and it combines with hemoglobin. And it permanently disables hemoglobin. So hemoglobin has high affinity for oxygen. It has a bit lower affinity for carbon dioxide, but it has even higher affinity for carbon monoxide. What this means is that now the red blood cells that have taken up carbon monoxide are not able to take up oxygen because that space is filled up with carbon monoxide. So the hemoglobin, each molecule hemoglobin that would take up 4 oxygen molecules, it would take up carbon monoxide instead, and now oxygen cannot bind to them because carbon monoxide has restricted that binding site. And the quantity of oxygen transported in the blood may now be 5 to 10% less in a smoker than in a non-smoker. So, of course, there's going to be various effects of this. There's going to be less oxygen supply to the heart muscle, putting a strain on the heart, which is obviously also going to increase heart rate and increase blood pressure. And another thing is that carbon monoxide may also damage the lining of arteries. It may damage the endothelium. So now we're going to briefly distinguish the difference between restrictive and obstructive lung diseases. So we have our 2 columns. One will discuss obstructive and one restrictive diseases. So obstructive disorders are typically characterized by the reduction in airflow. So this is going to be characterized by shortness of breath. So exhaling is going to be the problem with obstructive diseases. So the air is going to remain inside the lung after complete expiration. And it could lead to diseases like COPD and commonly asthma as well. Now, if we're looking in contrast to obstructive, the restrictive diseases, it is characterized by reduction in lung volume. So we got lower lung volume. So it's difficult to breathe in. Obstructive is difficult to exhale. Restrictive is difficult to inhale. And it's due to stiffness inside the lung tissue or the chest wall cavity. So it's due to stiffness. This is diseases that are called stiff lungs. So it's stiffness because they don't have enough elastic fibers and you cannot breathe in as easily. You have to work a lot harder with your muscles in order to stretch all of those tissues because elastin fiber is missing. And this could lead to something called interstitial lung disease. Again, this is because your muscles have to work harder in some areas versus others. So you're going to get scoliosis in the spine. There could be other neuromuscular causes and marked obesity as well. Now, this is a neat chart to memorize for the IMAT exam and specifically for this course because most lung diseases and most respiratory diseases are going to be qualified under one of these categories, obstructive or restrictive. So this concludes our lecture on the diseases associated with the respiratory and the cardiovascular systems.